Hey, it's Mr. Dykstra. In this video, we're going to be talking about water balance in the kidney. Have you ever wondered why we're told to drink 2 liters of water a day? Well, 2 liters seems to be an awful lot. It's the size of a typical milk jug or juice jug, as you can see on the screen here, or it's the equivalent of 8 large glasses of water in a day. We need that much fluid to help maintain our blood volume, but also to help filter out waste and for other metabolic processes, just to keep all of our cells hydrated. Now, typically, your blood has about a volume of 5 to 6 liters, depending on your body size. So you're replenishing up to 1/3 of that in a day as far as the liquid volume goes, the part of the plasma. Now, your kidneys are also tasked with filtering all of this blood through them. And on an average, in about a minute, they filter 120 milliliters out of 120 milliliters out of the blood into the kidney, to the nephrons of the kidney. And of that, we have to try and reabsorb as much of it as possible, unless, of course, we're well hydrated and have been drinking a lot. But for example, if we're playing sports like soccer or something, or you're out on a hot day, you get very dehydrated because of evaporation. And so we can actually reabsorb all the way down to 1 milliliter out of that. So out of 120 milliliters brought into the kidney, filtered into the kidney, we can produce only 1 milliliter of urine at a time. And of course, if we have more fluid in our body, we're well hydrated, we can produce more, up to about 15 milliliters of urine. So there's a large fluctuation there. And if you extrapolate that over time, you could last perhaps as much as 10 hours if it's a hot day and you're dehydrated without having to go to the washroom, or you could have to go as soon as half an hour because your bladder can hold up to about 600 milliliters maximum. And at about 200 milliliters, you're feeling that you have to go to that washroom. At 400, you're doing the bathroom dance, and at 600, you lose all control. So at 1 milliliter per minute or 15 milliliters per minute, there's a wide range that you could have there between half an hour and 10 hours that you can last between trips to the bathroom. So the urinary system, it looks fairly simple on paper. There's 2 kidneys, there's the ureter, the bladder, and the urethra. And then inside the kidneys, there's 2 layers. There's the medulla and the cortex. Essentially, you can see them differently by the basis of color, but there's also different levels of salts there that can help be involved with reabsorbing all those materials from the kidney, in particular the water. So let's start looking at a little bit more detail. So here's one of the nephrons, and you can see that the glomerulus up here, this is a capillary bed, and capillaries, you might know, have very thin cell walls, so only about 1 cell layer thick. And so what happens, as you can see there, there's an arterial coming in, and an arterial coming out. This is the only known instance in the human body that I'm aware of anyways, that has arterial blood pressure in a capillary bed. And so what happens is the blood starts to leak out of these capillaries because the high blood pressure and the only 1 cell layer thick causes gaps between the cells of the glomerulus. And so the liquid part, the plasma of the blood, starts to leak across. But we have this Bowman's capsule. This looks like a funnel around it, which is there to catch all the plasma that goes squirting out. And now anything that's in the Bowman's capsule is going to become urine unless we do something about it. Right? You can see that this nephron is all one tubule, right? It goes all the way out through, and then once it's in the ureter, it's going to go to the bladder, and there's nothing you can do about it anymore. Reabsorption stops once it's reached the collecting duct. So whatever passes through the collecting duct will be excreted as urine. There's nothing you can do about it. So what can we do about the rest of it, right? If we want to get reabsorb 119 milliliters out of those 120, we have to get started pretty quickly. And so that's what happens. Up here in the proximal tubule, we start reabsorbing a lot of sodium ions, and that's done by active transport. Active transport means it's going to cost some energy for that to happen. And so the sodium gets pumped out through these special sodium channels, and we pay some ATP for that to happen. And now once the sodium has left, you can imagine that there's going to be a charge imbalance. It's going to be very positive on the outside and negative inside the nephron. And so what is going to start happening then is we're going to get some chlorine and bicarbonate ions are going to flow out as well, following that charge attraction to the sodiums. And then once the chlorines, the negative ions have left, now we have a concentration gradient imbalance, osmotic gradient, and so water is going to start following as well. And then all the way down the descending loop of Henle here, we're going to have all kinds of water being reabsorbed back into the tissue fluid, and then of course you can see all the blood vessels tied closely around the nephron, and so they're going to end up going back into the bloodstream. And so this water is going to all be reabsorbed on the way down the descending loop of Henle. Other things that can happen are up in the proximal tubules. We can reabsorb some other valuable nutrients, things like glucose and amino acids. We can also start pumping some waste in, secreting, it's called secretion, of urea and hydrogen ions or acids that to help balance the pH of our blood, and also to remove as maximum amount of waste as we can. Ideally, we want to have a very concentrated urine full of urea without losing as much water as we can. Then as we go back up the ascending loop of Henle, so we've just lost all the water, and we start now reabsorbing some salt because we've lost more water than we should have, in a sense, right? And so permeability of this loop of Henle changes. So on the descending loop, going down here, only water can leave. Salts, it's impermeable to salts. So that causes a general movement of water out in this direction. And then on the ascending loop of Henle, we have, it's impermeable to water. So water cannot leave. Or water cannot come back in to balance the concentrations either. And so we only have permeability to our ions again. So we have our sodium and our chlorines. Their ions are going to start leaving again. And then in the distal tubule, we can actually control the permeability here. And so depending on how hydrated we are, we can allow more water to come out. We can also reabsorb more salts, more glucose, and more other things that are important. Some of it would be done by active transport again. If you decide that it's worth an ATP to save it, then your nephron will do that. And then finally you get into the distal collecting duct. And as I mentioned before, this is your final chance. If you haven't reabsorbed something by the end of the collecting duct, it's going to be lost forever as part of your urine. And so we have some water being reabsorbed there as well, and perhaps some salts. We can also have secretion of some urea and hydrogen ions as well to help balance the pH and to maximize the waste excretion. So if we look at the various different components here, you can see we have secretion up at the top here with urea right at the beginning, but we can also have secretion of urea in the distal tubule and the collecting duct as well. We can see some of the other things in here. We've noticed the glucose, you notice the amino acids being reabsorbed. What I want to highlight here in particular, it's the ions, because that kind of starts off the cascade effect. This is the sodium and chlorines coming out. On the descending loop of Henle over here, you can see the great amount of water reabsorption. On the way back up, we switch the permeability again, so now it's the salts, the ions. And then at the distal tubule, we again see the water coming out, and then whatever else the nephron decides to reabsorb in order to help maintain homeostasis. And I want you to also notice here it says it's variable. So we can actually control how much of those substances get reabsorbed there. And as far as water goes, the main key there is we have a hormone called ADH, which is going to be able to affect the permeability on this later region of the nephron so that we can reabsorb as much water as needed if we're dehydrated, or we can allow more water to be excreted if we have a lot of fluid in our blood. So how does that process work? Well, ADH is the hormone involved here. It's being secreted or made by the hypothalamus, and it's being released by the pituitary gland under control of the hypothalamus. So we have these cells in the hypothalamus called osmoreceptors, and they can detect when the cells grow or shrink. Right? If you have more water coming into the cells, they're going to expand, just like a balloon would. And if you're losing water, it's going to shrink. And so the osmoreceptors are going to detect the distance of the cell membrane of the cell. So they're going to see, is it shrinking or is it expanding? And if you're dehydrated, what's going to happen is you're going to have less fluid in your blood. And so you're going to have fluid from your cells leaving the cells, going into the blood to replenish your blood pressure and keep your blood volume up. And so all the cells in your body, including these osmoreceptors, are going to shrink, and that's going to then be detected in your hypothalamus, which is then going to signal the release of ADH. ADH is going to change the permeability of the latter portion of the nephron. So we're looking at this portion here, so that we can actually allow it to be permeable for water again, so we can reabsorb the maximum amount of water possible. So we can concentrate our urine down to as little as 1 milliliter, or we can allow it to be as 15 milliliters if we have been drinking lots and we're well hydrated. Another role here is the kidneys in blood pressure, and so we have a different system as well. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's like an internal blood pressure monitor system, just like the ones you use on your arm, but it's internal. Juxtaglomerular apparatus sounds very complicated, but if you know Latin at all, it just means next to the kidney thingy. Juxta is next to, glomerular has to do with the kidney, and apparatus is just the thingy. So I like to tell my students it's just the next to the kidney thingy. That's a lot simpler than working with these big words. So it's monitoring blood pressure, and particularly what it's looking for is if the blood pressure is low, it's going to release this hormone called renin, which is going to set off a cascade of a number of different chemicals, which the end result is going to be twofold. On the one hand, we're going to be constricting blood vessels, which means we can keep the blood volume up by limiting the space available. So we have the same amount of blood. When we're dehydrated, we have a little bit less volume, but if we narrow the space by constricting all of our blood vessels, the blood pressure can still be kept up, so we can get blood to our brain and oxygen to our brain so we don't faint. But that's only a short-term, immediate solution. We also need to prevent this from getting worse. And so aldosterone is again going to go back and target the nephron in the same area. The later part of the nephron is going to change the permeability there again. And what's particularly targeting is the sodium. Because if it increases more sodium, then chlorine is going to follow, and ultimately we're going to reabsorb more water as well. And so by reabsorbing as much salt and water as we can, we actually increase or keep the blood pressure as high as possible. The other thing to be aware of is our blood pH. So our pH has to be very, very carefully monitored to within 0.02, which is more accurate than a lot of our digital pH meters can even detect. And so a lot of our foods are acidic. So whether you're looking at your drinks like coffee and pop and soda and tea, and they're mostly acidic. Then you look at things like fruits and vegetables. A lot of them are acidic as well. That's why they have the tart citric taste. Breads and meats and fries and cereals are typically acidic as well when you think about the fatty acids and the proteins in them. And then also, of course, spicy foods are very, very acidic. So most of the stuff we take in is acidic. We also produce a lot of hydrogen ions or acid from waste products inside the respiration as well. So we need to buffer all of that, because if it go outside of this range, we're going to die. That's fatal. Our system would just shut down. So we have this buffer system that if we have extra acid, it can bind to this bicarbonate form, or carbonic acid, and it can actually be converted to carbon dioxide and water, which are neutral. You might have seen the system as well with the respiratory system. When we're breathing carbon dioxide in, we can actually dissolve more of it by going in the other direction. So this is an equilibrium. It's in balance. It shifts one way or the other, depending on what the need is the greatest. And then when it gets to the kidney, this process can be reversed, and so we can convert back to the acid, which could then be secreted into the nephron into the urine, and then we can excrete it out of our bodies to help maintain that pH. That's everything, and I hope that's helpful.